Hey everyone, and welcome to Dual Credit Biology, Unit 1, Lecture 1. This video is going to talk just about the basics of chemistry, and then I'm going to do a second video that will show you a little more in detail how to find the parts of an atom, an ion, and an isotope. So when I finish this lecture, if you're confused, go check out the second video to kind of get a little extra help on your worksheets. So when we talk about basic chemistry, the reason why we have to discuss that in biology is because we need to go all the way down here to the atomic level. I always tell students that we're like building blocks, and you start with one Lego and then several Legos together, and then more Legos, and eventually you get one of those great big Lego scenes that you used to make. And so we're going to start at the very smallest level, which is the atomic level, and talk a little bit about it. So some basic chemistry definitions, of course, would be matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. And matter can be anything. And one type of matter is the element. An element is basically a substance that you can't break down any further because if you do, it becomes something else. Now, in biology, we focus on a few of these elements, like the elements that make up our body. We're made mainly of oxygen. We're made of carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And then we have some other elements that we have in our bodies, but we don't have them in large quantities. So since they're in such small quantities, we call these trace elements. And just a few examples, there's more, but things like calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur would be examples of trace elements. So even though they're small, they're still important, and I'm going to show you an example of why. So this is what our normal human body looks like as far as the chemical composition. You can see that we are made mainly of oxygen. Then we consist of a lot of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and then right here you will see these trace elements make up this percentage right there. And then there's some little extra trace elements that a lot of times have to deal with where you live, the environment that you're in, the water you drink, the foods that you eat, because every soil composition has a different trace element. So therefore, you may have a little bit of a different chemistry than someone who lives around the world. But those trace elements, even though they're in small quantities, they're really, really, really important. And this is one example of what happens when you don't have the elements that you need. This is a plant that's in a good environment, and in this environment, they don't allow nitrogen in. And look at the difference in the two plants. This is a picture of an individual who has a growth that is called a goiter. We develop goiters when we do not get iodine. Well, here in the United States, we have a Food and Drug Administration that watches nutrients and trace elements that we need. And we take in iodinized salt. And that salt make sure that we have the quantity of iodine that we need so that we don't develop this growth known as a goiter. Individuals who live in countries that don't have an FDA, that have more third world countries, they don't have regulated foods and nutrients, and so they're more likely to develop a growth like a goiter. And so this is just from iodine. And if you remember, it wasn't even on one of the trace elements, so we just need a tiny little bit of it, and we get that by eating salt. So the atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the properties of an element, meaning that we can take oxygen, we can break it down to its smallest part, which would be an atom of oxygen. If I break up that atom of oxygen, it's no longer oxygen, it's something else. And so the atom is the smallest as we can get without changing the identity of that particular element. So atoms are made up of two main parts. You have a nucleus, and then around the nucleus you have this cloud. Inside the nucleus is where we find two of the subatomic particles. protons and neutrons. They reside inside the nucleus. Protons are single units of positive charge. Neutrons are neutral, meaning they have no charge. Therefore, our nucleus of all the atoms have an overall positive charge. The electrons are found outside of the nucleus in this cloud orbiting around the nucleus. And if you study chemistry, you know that they have a very specific pathway that they follow in order to be able to rotate around the nucleus the correct way. So what I want to do is I want to take a few minutes and just talk about how we find out how many protons, electrons, and neutrons that are in an atom. So in order for us to do that, we have to use the periodic table. So the periodic table is just a table. It's an instructional tool that chemists came up with that basically tell us all about every element. The periodic table has a long history of how they developed it. It's really quite interesting. We can look at the periodic table and even predict elements that have not been discovered yet, based on how it's put together. So it's really an extremely important document that we use in chemistry, well, and basically in any science. So when we use the periodic table, we can figure out what the atomic structure of an atom is by looking at the periodic table tile. When we look at a periodic table tile like this one, you will see that there's an atomic number and then there is a mass number. Okay, the atomic number tells us the number of protons that are in each atom of an element. So in this case, when we look at this particular element of carbon, the atomic number is 6. So that tells me that there are 6 protons in that particular atom. So an atom of carbon has 6 protons. Okay, the mass number tells me the weight of the nucleus. And so the mass number is, this way, the 12. So if I know the atomic number tells me how many protons, and I know the mass number tells me the protons and neutrons, I can do a simple subtraction problem to determine how many neutrons are there. And I just ask the man, mass number minus atomic number gives me the number of neutrons. So moving on forward, this is what the periodic table looks like, and there is a periodic table that you can pull up in the Google Classroom and look at. But this is what a periodic table would look like, okay? So I want to look at how we would determine the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons for each one of these elements. So when we look at calcium, calcium has an atomic number of 20 and a mass number of 40.1. For these particular problems, we always use the rounded whole number for the mass number. So instead of saying 40.1, we're just going to say 40. So the number of protons would be 20. And to find the number of neutrons, I ask the man, mass number minus atomic number gives me the number of neutrons, so that would be 20. But we haven't talked about how you find the number of electrons. So in a normal atom that has no charge, the number of electrons equals the number of protons. So if we have 20 protons, then that means we have 20 electrons. Okay, so let's look at this one right here. How many protons? 7. Electrons equal that, so how many electrons? 7. And then to find the number of neutrons, we ask the man. Mass number minus atomic number gives us 7. Pause your video, take a second, I want you to work out sulfur. So when you work it out, you should find that protons are 16, electrons are 16, and when you ask the man, it's 32 minus 16, which gives us 16. Now, I know all 3 of these have the same number for all 3 subatomic particles. It doesn't always work out that way, but these 3 did. So there's a couple more things that I want to discuss. It's electron arrangement. Electrons are really the guiding force of how an atom behaves, whether it's going to react with something, not react with something, how violently it reacts with something. So electrons are really important because that's where all the energy is. And electrons are found within the electron shell. So depending on the atomic number determines how many electrons are going to be there, which tells us how many shells that will be there. So electrons in the outer shell typically have the most energy, and I tell people, think about little kids. They're away from mama. The farther they get away from mama, the more energetic they become, and the more likely it is that they get into mischief. So the way that we determine how many electrons can go into each shell, we use this little formula, 2n squared. N stands for the shell number. So if we were looking at the first shell, 1 squared would be 1 times 2, means 2 electrons can go in the first shell. For the second shell, 2 squared would be 4 times 2 would be 8. So 8 electrons can go in the second shell, and so on and so forth. Now, electrons don't like to sit with one another unless they're forced to. So electrons will pair up once all the spots within a shell are taken up. And later on, just check out the next video and I kind of walk you through how you draw an atom. So this is a picture of what atoms would look like. Carbon has 6 electrons, so 2 goes in the first shell, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 go in the second shell for a total of 6. Remember, they don't pair up until they have to. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a second and I want you to find the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons for each one of these, okay? Once you've done that, I want you to hold off and watch the next video, which is going to show you how to draw that atom. So if you would just pause right here, find your number of protons, electrons, and neutrons. We'll go over that answer, and then in the next video, we'll talk about drawing them. So pause. Okay, so for oxygen, you should have found 888. For sodium, it's 11 protons, 11 electrons, and then there are 12 neutrons. Then for magnesium, it would be 12, 12, and 12. And remember, check the next video on how to draw them. 2 more things that I want to talk about, and then we'll be finished. Ions are special atoms. Ions are atoms that have lost or gained an electron. When you pick up more negative charge, then that means you become negative. So any atom that we see with a negative charge, it's written as a little superscript, that tells us that they've gained electrons. So if it was a -2, I know it gained 2 electrons. If it was a -3, I know it gained 3 electrons. The opposite for positive charges. A positive charge means that it lost some of its negativity, so it gave up some electrons. So a +2 means that it lost 2 electrons. So carbon normally has 6, so a carbon with a -2 means now it has 8 electrons. A carbon with a +2 means now that it has 4 electrons. We name the electrons based on their charges. A cation has an ion that has a positive charge. And I always remember it because that T is like a positive sign. Then anions are atoms that have gained electrons and they now have a negative charge. And then the last thing that I want to discuss are isotopes. Isotopes are really important because we use isotopes a lot in biological research and in medicine. If you've ever had to go in and maybe drink that barium in order to have a GI scan, or maybe you had to have an IV that they put in you before they did a body scan on you, they were giving you a radioactive isotope, and as it decays, it gives off light under a certain type of X-ray machine. And so they can look for blockages or things like that. So we use isotopes a lot in medicine. All an isotope is an atom that has a change in the number of neutrons. So ions have a change in electrons, isotopes have a change in neutrons. Notice that protons never, ever, 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 ever change. So isotopes change in neutrons, ions change in electrons. When we write an isotope, we write it as a large dash and the new mass number. So this is a normal carbon atom, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. This is carbon-13. For carbon-13, it has 6 protons, and then when you say 13 minus 6, you get 7 neutrons and 6 electrons. To make sure that we don't get this one mistaken with this one, we write a -13, and so on and so forth. And these are just some pictures using radioactive isotopes for medicine. We also use them when we're doing slides sometimes. They'll use a radioactive isotope. Okay, so we're going to stop there with this video. I'm going to suggest that you take a few minutes and you go check out the next video on learning how to find the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons for atoms, ions, and isotopes, and as well as how to draw them. And then you can go and complete the Bohr worksheet as well as the parts of the atom worksheet.